something as brave as love something as uncertain as a human life. That is the bravest thing we do, is love something as uncertain as a human life.
I'm Heather Grzych, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrzych.com or on Instagram at heathergrzych. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Today, I'm here with Yael Goldstein-Love, who is the author of the novels Overture, The Passion of Tasha Darsky, and most recently, The Possibilities, which the New York Times called a beautiful, exciting book, People magazine called a powerful page-turner with deep wisdom, and Good Morning America said taps into those primal feelings every nurturer feels and fears. She's also a doctoral candidate in clinical psychology and sees psychotherapy patients in private practice in Oakland, California, focusing on maternal mental health and the transition to parenthood. And she lives with her son in Berkeley, California. Yael, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, let's just get right into it. I want to start with one of the central themes of your most recent novel, The Possibilities. So, what are these primal feelings that every nurturer feels and fears?
Oh, there are so many of them. I mean, I think that the one that is most central to the book, although it morphs into others, is sort of terror. The terror that is the flip side of like engagement and joy, the terror of losing something that you are this invested in. So, I think that that was what took me by surprise the most in becoming a mother, was I had always been someone who held kind of loosely. I'm sort of the kind of person who, like, if you're on a plane and something's going wrong, well, I had a good run. This is fine. And suddenly you have a child and you're like, I do not hold loosely to this world anymore. I am very invested in this piece of the world. And it brought with it this fear of loss. Terror is really what I would call it. And the more I would surrender to that terror, good way, not in a fighting it way, the more I would also feel the flip side, which was almost just the sparkling beauty of every moment was so much crisper because of that. So I think terror is the main primal emotion in there, but rage, frustration, intimacy. I think there's something about being with a newborn that brings up everything for us in the purest way, which is part of what makes it such a difficult period and also part of what makes it such a fascinating period. So yeah, I think those are the primal feelings and fears in a nutshell.
Yeah, and you've already brought up a lot of the maternal archetypes that come up with rage. And we've all heard terms like mama bear. We've heard tiger mom. We've heard, MILF. We've heard all these different types of archetypes for mamas, anxious mother being one of them. And, it's funny because I was thinking earlier, do we have these like similar archetypes for the dads? I'm like, do they exist? The only one that came to mind for me when I started thinking about it was the deadbeat dad. But like, I don't know. Do you think there are similar archetypes
No,
for dads?
for some reason, when you said that, my first association was dad jokes. It's like not an archetype, just like a thing the dad does, a charming, lovable. I mean, there's dad bod now, but no, I don't think there are dad archetypes in the way that there are mom archetypes, because I don't think we reduce dads to just their dad role in the way that we are so pulled to reduce moms to just their mom role and then categorize them.
Yeah, I think you're right. And this book, The Possibilities, it's a pretty wild thriller about a psychological experience of becoming a new mother. And without giving too much away, can you talk a little bit about this psychological experience of being a new mother? I mean, you did already, but what is that transformation that we really go through becoming a mother?
That's such a good question and such a big question. I mean, in some sense, I think the first thing I want to say is no answer to that because it's different for each of us. But then the sort of the more general answer is that the reason it's different for each of us is that what it does, this becoming a mother, it stirs up all the psychological sediment from our past. It's like, everything about how we were mothered, how we were cared for, things that we don't even remember, that only our body remembers. And then being in that intense intimacy with an infant that, most of us have never experienced that kind of intimacy except for when we were infants and cared for. It stirs up so much that is held in our body, these sort of procedural memories. And so we're dealing with all of that, whether consciously or unconsciously, while we're also dealing with sleeplessness, while we're also dealing with the primitive, unmediated emotions of these infants that sort of they communicate themselves into us with these cries, and then we have to process those emotions for them. Like, it is such a wild period. And so that, I think, is sort of the like architecture of what each person has to go through. And then what does the building look like? It's everything to do with what is it for you? What was that sediment for you? What's the bedrock on which your self was built? And then the one other part of this that I feel like is important to highlight is just, I think for every mother, I can't say this definitively because I haven't spoken to every mother, but I'm pretty convinced that for every mother, part of that psychological transition is you have to mourn. You have to mourn who you were before your child, because for better and for worse, usually, that person's gone. Like, you are a new person. And within a year or two, those may be seamlessly like the same person, but at first they do not. I remember I just taken my son home from the hospital. Maybe it was like our first day home even. I remember I walked into my bedroom and I just burst out crying. And the thought that was going through my head as I was crying was, you used to be a person in this room. And I didn't feel like a person anymore in that simple sense of, these are my borders. When I have needs, I meet them. I was like a system. I was something more like a fungus or a redwood grove. It's this system of several bodies. And that can be beautiful. And that can be, I think there's so much beauty and power and wonder in that. And there's something to mourn because something has ended and something new has started.
Wow. That's really telling because, all right, how many times do we hear somebody say after they've had a baby, I want to get my body back. I want to get this back. I want to get that back.
That is such a good point. I never really thought about that language before, but you're absolutely right. That idea of I want to get X back is like one of the most common things we say right after we have a child, as though we can really get that old self back, but we can't. There's the psychoanalyst Galit Atlas, who writes a lot about this period, calls this, she says that this psychological transition of becoming a mother, it's a period of either breakdown or breakthrough. Like, it can only be one or the other because it's such a big, dramatic thing, a gap, a rift that has been created. And I think that, yeah, that I want to get X back is like a really nice expression of, I don't want it to be a breakdown or a breakthrough. I want to just undo and go back to what I was. And we all have that fantasy, and it's not actually possible.
Yeah, I love the language that you used about feeling like a system after the baby's born. And a lot of people, we're not the same after we have a baby. And a lot of people don't really understand what happens. Even if you have a baby, maybe we have an intuitive sense of some of these things once somebody names them. But, just the idea of the fact that our bodies have expanded so much and stretched out that we become a little latticed and we have more space within us. And that sort of creates more capacity for different things, even like stretching out, having the baby there and then coming back together. We never come back together the same exact way in our core and things like that. And, it's just really a huge transformation. Another aspect of motherhood that a lot of people don't realize, and maybe this goes into another topic of like maternal attachment, but biologically speaking, the mother is changed biologically because she continues to have the baby's cells in her body, not just, stem cells, like some of them have actually become parts of her body. The baby's, cell-free DNA and actual stem cells have actually become, joined up with organs in her body. And so, I interviewed a couple of years ago a woman, Jaylene Nelson, who does this research at University of Washington at Fred Hutch, and they research that this phenomenon. It's called microchimerism, maternal fetal microchimerism. And a lot of us as mothers feel this strange attachment to our children that we may have never had with any other being, right? And here's one example of the biological proof that it is beyond what any of us can understand. Now, there's the biological attachments, right? In one of your books, you write a lot about breastfeeding and what a wild attachment that is. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, yeah. And I think that that's such a good example of this bridge. Like, it's so hard to actually separate the psyche soma, right? With things like this, like biological attachment, psychological attachment. Do these entirely come apart? No, I mean, sometimes. But yeah, with the breastfeeding, I mean, something that was really important to me in writing the possibilities and trying to capture this experience of the transition to motherhood and just what a psychologically trippy experience it was. I wanted it to be deeply embedded in the mother's body because I think so much of what is so interesting about what happens to us in that period is what happens to our bodies. And we have, as a culture, a sort of, and not just our culture, I mean, I think this is true in many, many, many cultures, this sense of like wanting to separate from the mother's body. That is the thing, that is like the task of maturation, right? Separating from the mother's body. So we all want to separate from the mother's body. And I wanted to kind of do exactly the opposite of that. And so in the possibilities, milk letdown, which is such a wild thing. It's like your body knows when your baby is near, knows when your baby is hungry, responds to your baby's cry, and also like calibrates how much milk it makes based on like how much your baby ate last time. That wordless communication that you're not even privy to is so wild. And so I really wanted to do something with that was central to the plot. And so what I did was I made that sort of milk letdown communication system be kind of a cosmic homing device in the book. So this child is sort of, it's a multiverse adventure story, where this mother is sort of having to go through multiple worlds to find her child, multiple realities. And the only homing system she has on this child is her milk letdown. Her milk letdown lets her know when her child is sort of blinking in and out of their reality. And to me, that just captures something so fundamental, again, about this shift to motherhood of like, oh, my body knows so much that I don't know about this task of caring for a baby. And I have to sort of just learn to use it as another tool.
Yeah, it's pretty wild for anybody who's experienced it. And it's not something you can even imagine before it happens to you. You can't even imagine, even though people say, oh, it's connected to the sweat glands or whatever. It's just very different than sweating. It's super different. So you started writing more realistic novels and then went a little more speculative in this last one. How did that shift? I'm really interested in that shift for you. Why? What brought you to this sort of magical kind of place?
Yeah. It was motherhood. It was becoming a mother. I had task with this book was to figure out how do I capture what this felt like to me. This is exactly as you say, like not just with the milk letdown, but everything about it. You think because you're around mothers and you read it and you've been a child and you're like, I know what this is going to be like. And it's nothing like you expect. And it's so trippy. I mean, I think I keep using that word, but that is like, it is just so trippy. And I, in particular, had a bad entry into motherhood in the sense that my son almost died during childbirth. So, actually, the first scene of the book is the birth of my son, really. It's like the one thing that's really taken from my own life. And, this moment of like you give birth to this child and they can't tell you whether this child has lived or died. And I actually, as it actually occurred, they couldn't tell me for over an hour, whether my son had lived or died. So I was lying there in the recovery room, just sort of stunned and terrified, having no idea if I was taking home a baby or I was in the midst of an unfolding tragedy. And then he was fine. It turned out he had enough of a reserve of cord blood of oxygen rather in his cord blood. So he was fine. He was unharmed. We could take him home. But the reason he was unharmed, the reason he had that reserve of oxygen was because I had insisted on a C-section. I'd been in labor for like 27 hours. And then, but things were sort of, there were these indications that like he wasn't responding well. There was something amiss. And they wanted me to just go ahead with it. And I was like, my intuition was like, no, you're telling me that every time there's a really big contraction, his oxygen drops. To me, that indicates like he's not going to do well with the python squeeze of labor. So cut me open. And the doctor didn't want to. And I was like, do it. And that was what saved his life, was that I sort of insisted on that. And the fact that my intuition, my maternal instincts, the very first time they were used in the very first moment I had a child, were what separated him from life and death, that had a big effect on me. And so I brought him home and felt like still any moment I could be called on again to have those instincts. Any little snuffle. I think the other thing they don't tell you is like how many sounds newborns make. And they're weird sounds. They sound like little snuffling pills. So it's like any little sound, any little cough, anything, I'd be like, oh my gosh, like, okay, it's happening again. And so it put me in a weird state. And I didn't know how to tell people about this, like people's like, how are you? Like, people expect you to be so happy. And I was so happy. And something else was going on too. And I could not figure out how to tell people about it. And that too, it's like that had its own bad effect. I was then like isolated in this sort of bubble of pain and terror until I finally hit on this metaphor that I felt allowed me to say what I was actually feeling. And the metaphor was that it felt as though, since having a baby, every way that reality could have gone was real, was sort of equally real. That sort of the borders between possibilities, between close calls and safety, were so much thinner than they had ever been before. So like that my son almost died on the operating table, it felt like that had a kind of reality that lingered next to our reality. But then other little things, like, it's like that moment your kid almost rolls off the changing table, but you stop them at the last minute. That moment they almost slip under the water in their ducky bath, but they don't. It's like each of those felt like another world sort of hovering next to my own and having some sort of danger in it. And I was like, once I hit on that, this is my psychological reality. This is how I can speak about this. But the only way to do that is to write a kind of speculative fiction novel where I take that seriously. I act as though that is what actually occurs and see where that takes me. And so that's what I did.
Wow. Now, you're also a psychotherapist, and I'm curious, because that is so traumatic to go through, were you also seeing a therapist at that point? Because I personally use writing as therapy, I will admit. Were you seeing a therapist that you could say that to at the time?
I am so embarrassed to say that I was not, because it's so ridiculous given that I am a psychotherapist. I remember after the trauma of his birth, my doula recommended someone. She was like, here's somebody who specializes in birth trauma. You should see her. And I wrote to her, but I could only see her without my child. And I didn't have any childcare. And so I was like, I can't do it. I really regret that now. And so much of my practice actually now is seeing mothers sort of in that transition to motherhood. And I see how important it is to have someone to process that with, especially if you've had something like a traumatic birth. And I so regret that I didn't. And I sort of look back and I'm like, and there was the reality to contend with, which is I didn't have childcare and I was being asked to come in without my child. So what was I going to do?
It wasn't really that accessible to you. And I think that's kind of a theme that comes up with postpartum care a lot, is like we have all these like, you have to make an appointment and show up at a certain time. And there's just so many disruptions. I remember when my son was born, I was like so hesitant to make appointments with people because you just never know when something's going to happen with the baby, and you want to be there for your baby when they need you, and they're not predictable the way that we try to be as adults.
Yes, to put it lightly, that is so true. Yeah.
Well, so here's a question, and it's great that you're doing this work now, because maybe even though you kind of know what people need because you went through it yourself, do people then bring their babies with them to see you, or do you meet them on Zoom and it's like easy?
Yeah, I try to be extremely flexible, so Zoom it's great that Zoom is now an option. Back when I had my son, like, there was no such thing as Zoom therapy. It was really the pandemic that ushered this in. And so that's an option. Fantasizing lately, this hasn't come up yet, but I've been fantasizing lately about, like, house calls. I have to look into the insurance for that. Would I have to get, like, extra insurance? Would I have to But it seems to me like it would make so much sense for postpartum mothers in particular to sort of have psychotherapy that's like, yeah, you don't have to go anywhere. Somebody comes to you. And I can imagine there being something really interesting about seeing the mother in the place where she's mothering. Like, there's so much extra information there. So yeah, that's something I don't know that I would say I've been like planning for that so much as just fantasizing about that lately. But I am really curious about it and have been meaning to look into the practicalities of it.
Yeah, there's a lot of, postpartum doulas. I have, a friend that like trains postpartum doulas to do that, not to give psychotherapy services when they go to the house, but there's a lot of body treatments and certain types of food and herbs and stuff like that that are helpful at that time. But just, being practical, right? You have to charge more money when you go to their house because then you lose a client like before and after commuting and stuff like that. So it's harder. I mean, meeting people online is sadly more cost effective, and that's a whole other separate conversation. But, one of the reasons that it's just challenging to deliver really great care for people in the healthcare system, at house calls and things like that. Back to this idea of maternal feelings in the postpartum period, some people suggest that the prevalence of an anxiety disorder in postpartum women is generally the same as it might be in the general population of women, where other people say, no, 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 it's higher. And maybe the challenges of actually being able to study women in those situations because they can't come in with the baby and they're like, I don't have any capacity to come in and do a study because I'm trying to take a shower, you know, or whatever. And I guess what are some of the factors that will influence whether someone will have anxiety, like the physical causes, like you said earlier, lack of sleep, in Ayurveda, we talk about the improper nutrition factor, like dehydration, erratic schedules. We have a way of talking about it with the 5 elements with air and space, like too much air and space elements, increasing that anxiety, and the things that kind of take us away from feeling like calm and grounded and warm and loved and like predictable. But what do you think some of the, I guess, psychological and sociological and interpersonal factors are around maternal anxiety?
That's such a great question. I'm going to preface it by saying this is going to be part of the answer, in fact. I don't think there is any new parent who's acting as a real caregiver who doesn't have heightened anxiety. It is part and parcel of that period. And in fact, like, it's not even just heightened anxiety, it's heightened vigilance, very specific vigilance, checking behaviors, like checking that the baby is breathing over and over again. It's actually even something like 98% of new parents who are involved caregivers, doing caretaking responsibilities, have intrusive thoughts. Intrusive thoughts as like a very radical symptom, that you'd have these thoughts like, oh my God, what if I drop the baby? What if I hit the baby? What if I mean, even crazy things like, what if I put the baby in the blender? You'd think that these would be things that would tell you like somebody's having a really hard time adjusting. They're not. These are almost like something approaching universal in new parents. And it's because it's built into our system. Like, this hypervigilance to the dangers is how our mammalian system has sort of equipped us to take care of these extremely fragile beings. And so our brains just kick in and they become incredibly vigilant. And part of that is like running through crazy scenarios, which is where those intrusive thoughts come from.
And do you mean it's sort of similar to obsessive compulsive disorder? Is it a state that's similar?
It is a state that is almost to differentiate. So there has been a huge rise in diagnoses of obsessive compulsive disorder and in postpartum obsessive compulsive disorder, I should say. And there is a lot of reason to believe, based on the research, that this is almost entirely based on this sort of rise in the diagnosis is entirely based on the fact that people don't realize how normal this is. So they have these symptoms, they react to it with this sort of horror at themselves. Oh my God, I'm not dealing well. Something's going wrong. Like I'm having these crazy thoughts or I'm having these crazy checking behaviors. I need to control that. And it's the attempt to control it that sort of raises it to the level of suffering that actually then warrants a diagnosis of OCD. So, if you don't have a pre-existing diagnosis of OCD, if you already have OCD, a pre-existing diagnosis or pre-existing symptoms, and then you have a child, it could really, really exacerbate true OCD. If you don't have pre-existing symptoms and suddenly with a child, you start developing something that seems to you like OCD, chances are not bad that it is not OCD, that actually what's happening is something very, very normal. And what would actually lessen your symptoms is just realizing how normal it is and being okay with it and sort of thinking, this too shall pass. This is part of this period for me and it's a crazy period. I mean, that's sort of the first part of the answer to your question is like how comfortable we are with our own anxiety is a huge part of how we're going to tolerate or how much suffering that anxiety is going to cause to us in that period. And then how much support we have. That's huge. Like, do we have people taking care of us? Do we feel cared for? Another tremendous one is how comfortable are we with dependency, with ourselves being dependent? Because that can come up in a number of ways. Number one, if you're not comfortable with being dependent, it's going to be very hard for you to ask for what you need from others that you can take care of your child. But also, I'll speak from personal experience here. I had this really weird experience with my son when he was really little, where he would be, it seemed like he was just nursed like all day, every day. And I sometimes be like, he's so needy. That's a crazy thought because of course he is. He's like a week old. What is he but a bundle of needs? And it was in thinking through that reaction of mine that I kept having that I realized how uncomfortable I was with my own neediness, my very normal dependency needs. And because I wasn't comfortable with it in myself, I was sort of offended by it in him. And so that was causing me some anxiety. And how comfortable we are with our different attachment styles. If we tend to like have very insecure attachment or like a very low tolerance of uncertainty, we're going to be anxious in a certain way where we're going to be anxious about like, am I doing everything right? Is everything on schedule? Is he safe or she safe? If we have a more avoidant attachment style, their clinginess might make us anxious. So it's just like every aspect of our psychology is going to in some way play out in how our maternal anxiety affects us.
Wow. And it's hard to talk about anxiety because it's like, even just talking about it, it sort of puts you in this heightened state of arousal, even just like thinking about anxiety and talking about anxiety. So I'm glad that you kind of touched upon attachment and that the postpartum experience and the young mothering, any child, but especially a young child really brings up those maybe unique dynamics that we have with our attachment. And then do you think that from a psychological perspective, do you think that there is a balanced state of attachment? Like, does one exist? I mean, I know what the Buddhists would say, but what would be sort of the general proper level of attachment from a psychologist's perspective?
Ooh, that's such a good question. I mean, I don't know if there is some one proper level. I mean, of course, you ask 20 psychologists and you'll get 20 different answers. So I'll just say from my perspective that, well, okay, I'm going to complicate this a little bit, which is I think we often talk in terms of attachment styles as though like we just have one attachment style. And in fact, we have different attachment styles with each person we're attached to. We have many attachment styles and we can slip between styles, with any one of these people as well. So I think we have, rather than talking about attachment styles, I tend to speak more about like our patterns, our unique patterns of relating to self and other. And for each of us, it's a unique tapestry. And for some of us, that unique tapestry brings joy and connection more than suffering. And for others, the balance is tipped more. I don't think there's ever a way to get it so that it's tipped entirely in the joy. Like it's always going to be some balance of joy and suffering. And so I think that the closest thing I can come to an idea of balance is you can take pleasure in connection. You are comfortable with dependency, your own and others, and you know how to take turns with who gets to be dependent. And on balance, you maybe get as much joy as pain from your connections. And like, I think that would be my idea of what balance is in attachment. I'm so curious what the Buddhist line on it is.
Well, I mean, I guess I think about it maybe more the yogic perspective on it, which is that, we're all just going back and forth between attachment and aversion. And I guess I also think about it from like a physics perspective of, when things connect versus converging, diverging, like just the constant movement and mixing of things. And I like how you said that if you're going to have the attachment, you're also going to have the pain. And I like that there's almost like this equal equation. Although I heard a study that said we will feel, say somebody gives us $1 or $10 or something, or $1,000, whatever, something that we would feel attached to. Somebody gives you $1,000 and you'll feel a certain level of attachment when they give you that, the pleasure of that attachment. But if somebody were to take $1,000 from you, that the sense of loss we feel 10 times greater than the sense of gain that we would have from an equal thing. I don't remember exactly where I heard that, but I really love that idea. And it also comes with like, well, yeah, if you're going to feel connection, attachment to something, well, that thing could be taken away. And this goes back to your beginning with, I have this baby and I love it so much. And oh my God, suddenly I realized that if anything ever happened to this baby, if it ever left for whatever reason, I might die because of the pain. I mean, it's really serious. Like I feel it too as a mom.
It's really serious. And by the way, what you mentioned about sort of like the pain of the loss is so much greater than the pain of the gain with the money or, any other like windfall that comes your way, including a child. That is a very well replicated find. That's like one of the few very well replicated findings in social science. Like that is, I think we can actually trust that that is true. And yeah, I mean, I think, you put it beautifully. And that is so much of what I wanted to capture in this book is how do you do something as brave as love something that is as uncertain as a human life? That is the bravest thing we do, is love something as uncertain as a human life. My son actually, the other night, he posed this question really well that I think got to the heart of what you're saying here, which is he was asking me, he said, why would you care if I died? You'd be sad if I died. You weren't sad before I was born. And I was like, yeah, great. And the answer I gave him, I said, because when I came to love you, when you were born, a love developed in me that was so big that it takes up most of me now. So if you died, there'd be a huge hole in me where the love for you used to be. Yeah, that is the hardest thing about being alive, is that to love another person requires vulnerability. And vulnerability means you are open to pain and you will feel it. I mean, the people we love hurt us inevitably. I mean, if they didn't, it would mean that we weren't really intimately connected to them.
Wow. Yeah, that's just part of life. And this has been really fun talking about this with you and just reflecting on how special it is to have a child. And there's a lot of dynamics around people who want to have a child and can't have a child. And also, one of the cool things about your book is that there's like a twist with your character about whether or not she really has this child, right? And there's a lot of interesting things our minds do that even when our minds believe that we have a connection with something, we can still feel a loss. Like a woman who wants to have a baby, believes that she's going to have a baby and like never has that baby, but believes that there's this baby out there for her. There's like a real connection is another sort of dynamic related to this that I think you highlight really well in the story. And final question today. What does the wisdom of the body mean to you?
I think it means paying attention to the uniqueness of every embodied moment and being open to the data that is arising from every piece of you at every moment. Not overly attending to that data, but being open and curious to it.
I like that caveat you threw in there. You're like, not being overly like, don't get so self-obsessed, okay? But pay attention to yourself.
Well, I suddenly was thinking about hypochondria, and I was like,
yeah.
if you overattend, then you're like, I'm having a heart attack, like every time you have coffee. But, again, that balance.
I like that word, overattend, right? Attend in a balanced way, develop a good state of attachment to yourself. I love it so much.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. That's beautifully said.
Yael, thank you so much for being here. I've had a lot of fun with you today and I've learned a lot and I hope the audience has as well.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a pleasure.
If you are embarking on a fertility journey and are ready to have your mind blown about what your body is really capable of and how it's impacted by the environment, then check out my book, The Ayurvedic Guide to Fertility. You can actually download the introduction to the book for free on my website at heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, Grzych.com. Read the intro for free and then buy the rest of this fertility enlightening book pretty much anywhere books are sold. You want a full human experience when you seek a healthcare provider, and you don't want 15 minutes with someone who can't even try to find out the root cause of things because they're so overwhelmed themselves. You have a body, a mind, a heart, and dare I say it, even emotions. You're not crazy. Everything does affect you, and it's possible to feel better if you have the support you need. Set up an appointment with me to heal naturally. Go to heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, Grzych.com. Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrzych.com. That's Heather, Grzych.com. And meet me here next time on the Wisdom of the Body.